Welcome, dear listener, to our channel. Some losses break you, others shape you. Mike Morrison thought he had it all, until life shattered everything he knew. But in the wreckage of heartbreak, betrayal, and redemption, one question remained: was it ever truly his to begin with? As Mike Morrison drove down Wesley Drive, he glanced at the 11 houses lining the street from the corner to his own. He had personally framed 8 of them. The remaining 3 had been built by John Perry, a local contractor. There had always been a rivalry between Perry Construction and Curtis Construction Incorporated, where Mike worked, but it was never hostile. In fact, when John once ran out of concrete 3/4 through a pour, Curtis Construction had sent their crew over to help. That camaraderie, however, didn't extend to the situation unfolding now. "I didn't realize I was the problem here," Mike muttered, his voice thick with tension. "There's no need for this," John started, but Mike cut him off. "Not another word," Mike growled, his anger rising. John shifted in his seat as if preparing to stand, but Mike shoved him back down. "Mike, don't you dare!" Rhonda screamed, her voice cracking. John sneered. "I thought you'd be a man about this." Mike's jaw clenched. "What part of "not another word" is so hard for you to understand?" His hand lashed out, striking John across the face. The stunned expression that followed almost made Mike smile. Almost. But his mind was elsewhere. He thought back to Rhonda. She had been a somewhat awkward 18-year-old when they first met at an auto parts store. Mike had noticed her muttering angrily to herself, frustrated as she tried to figure out which battery she needed for her Nissan. "The charts are right here," Mike had offered quietly. "Yeah. Well, my car's not on there," she snapped, pointing at the store employee. "And Tweedledum over there is too busy sitting on his lazy butt to help." Mike had chuckled. "What kind of car do you have?" He quickly found the right battery and even offered to install it for her. Their second date had been a revelation. Rhonda had led him into her bedroom, pulled open her closet, and gestured to the overflowing rows of shoes, boots, sandals, and 6 pairs of flip-flops. Mike smirked. 6 pairs? What, one for each toe? Rhonda had playfully swatted his arm, laughing, and that was the moment he realized just how affectionate she could be. As their relationship deepened, so did Rhonda's pregnancy. She had been mildly attractive when they first met, but as her pregnancy progressed, she seemed to bloom, radiating a glow he hadn't noticed before. By the time she gave birth to their daughter, Michelle Christina Morrison, she had filled out in more ways than one, physically, emotionally, even in her presence. Mike was still lost in those thoughts when a voice thundered through his head, snapping him back to the moment. "That no-good snake," Lyle spat. "Exactly what I called him," Mike muttered, a tight smile forming on his lips. Mike let out a slow breath, staring off into the distance. "Dang it. I should have said something." Across from him, Lyle snapped his wallet open, rifling through its contents. "Said something about what?" Mike asked, watching as Lyle pulled out a business card and handed it over. "That picnic a while back. I saw John hanging around Rhonda, seemed a little too friendly," Lyle admitted. Mike took the card, glancing at it. "That's Tran's daughter," Lyle continued. "She's the one who kept Mary Lynn from getting half the company when she left me last time." Mike barely heard him. His thoughts were elsewhere. Lately, Michelle and Mickey had made it painfully clear how much they preferred being with their mother and John. "We could be water skiing with Mom and Mr. John," Michelle had sneered when Mike suggested going to the Y instead. "Yeah, Dad," Mickey chimed in. "I even got a boogie board." Mike felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. John Perry was becoming a bigger problem than he had anticipated. Trouble deepened when Mike placed a bid for a major office building contract in Raquel Falls. When he sat before the board, he could see the skepticism written all over their faces. "You're living with a woman you're not married to," Harley Ritt noted, flipping through statements and receipts. Mike listened carefully as both sides were presented. But then Barbara Trenton, the mediator, played a tape of him venting about not having enough access to his children. Rhonda's voice followed, smug and unwavering. "If he had just signed the original petition, he'd have more time with them," she said. Mike clenched his jaw. "So, Mrs. Morrison, the children are pawns. You want money so you use them?" he snapped. "It's not like that," her attorney Brian White quickly interjected. "Mrs. Morrison does have expenses." "Mr. Morrison also has expenses," Mike grumbled. The meeting dragged on, but by the time 5:30 came and went, Mike still hadn't heard from Rhonda about picking up the kids. By 6 o'clock he was getting irritated. By 6:30 Rhonda, growing frustrated, grabbed her phone and dialed Mike's number again. This time, instead of ringing, she was met with an automated message. This number is no longer in service. Frowning, she tried again. Same result. You about ready? John asked as he descended the stairs, dressed in a dark suit. Does it look like it? Rhonda shot back. Mike hasn't picked the kids up yet. Then call him, John snapped, his handsome face twisting in frustration. Gee, great idea, John, Rhonda shot back sarcastically. Why didn't I think of that? Somewhere across town, Mike sat alone, his head buried in his arms. The weight of it all crushed down on him, and before he knew it, he was sobbing, deep, painful sobs that seemed to go on for hours. When he finally lifted his head, sluggish and disoriented, he barely recognized the world around him. Mike scanned the empty house. Rhonda had already taken anything of real value. What remained held only sentimental worth, and even that had been tarnished by the pain of his children's rejection. Sighing, he loaded what he could into his truck and drove it to a consignment shop. They were more than happy to take most of the furniture off his hands, appreciating that he had brought it in himself. With his divorce finalized in Oakleaf, Texas, Mike decided to celebrate, his own way. He headed to Tiana Jack's, ordered a half-pound burger with spicy fries, and washed it down with 2 ice-cold draft beers. Feeling indulgent, he even sprung for a $50 dance from an innocent-looking redhead with an infectious smile. Work at least wasn't hard to find. Scuro Construction reached out to L. Curtis, who not only vouched for Mike but told them he was better than he claimed to be. The pay was solid, the work steady, and the crew knew what they were doing. Life moved forward. Dinner that night was a lively affair, except for the quiet moment when Joe bowed his head to say grace. Mike learned that Joey played football for St. Peter and Paul High School, while Cheryl, a senior at Sacred Ascension, had plans to major in biosynthetic engineering at the University of Louisiana. She must get it from her mama, Joe said proudly. Definitely doesn't come from me, Mike chuckled. Catherine Marie turned to Tony, who had been unusually quiet. You've barely said a word, she noted. Tony sighed. I'm starting my last year of college, he mumbled, not looking up. Lyle yawned, then let out a laugh, shaking his head. Sorry, he said, rubbing his eyes. He turned to Catherine Marie. Thanks for having me at your table. Before heading out, he surprised Joe by pulling him into a firm hug. It's been a while, Joe, he said, his voice thick with something unspoken. Been a while since I sat at a kitchen table like that. The next day at work, Joe showed no sign that Mike had been a guest in his home. He barked orders, pointed fingers, and yelled, just like usual. But at 3 o'clock he called it a day. Mike stayed behind to clean up, half expecting Joe to return with an invitation to come back for dinner. But he never did. Inside, laughter rang out as Tony's younger siblings played, giggling as one wiggled free from a tickle fight. They do that all the time, Tony said, rolling her eyes. What married people are supposed to do, Mike replied with a grin. Tony's face flushed, adding a warmth to the room. Without another word, the 20-year-old turned and left the kitchen. Where are you going? Supper's just about ready, Joe called after her. To my room, she answered. Joe wasn't having it. How about you set the table first? Before she could respond, Mike stepped in. Hey, I can do that. Joe shook his head. You're a guest. First time for everything, Mike said with a small smile. Mike smirked. First time I was a guest. Second time I'm family. He grabbed a brush, eyeing the newly applied primer and fresh coat of stark white semi-gloss while the electricians wrapped up their rough work. Nearby, Carlos shrugged and grabbed a broom and dustpan. Hey, Morrison. Joe called out. Yeah. Mike responded, setting down his brush. Joe's expression was unreadable, stern, almost wary. Tony wants to know if you're coming over for dinner tonight. Mike hesitated. I guess. He glanced at Joe, puzzled by his tone. Joe exhaled sharply, folding his arms. Listen, man. She's only 20. She's half your age. Hey, no, Joe. I haven't done anything, Mike protested, holding up his hands. Joe stared at him for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Meanwhile, at the county office, Rhonda sat across from Barbara, her voice laced with frustration. He's paid his half for Michael A. Morrison Jr.'s soccer camp. He's also covered his share of the dental visits, Barbara said flatly. Rhonda's jaw tightened. Could you at least tell me how to get in touch with him? She pleaded. No, Barbara replied, turning back to her monitor with the same cold detachment. Rhonda scoffed. I hope one day you have kids of your own and have to deal with someone like you. Barbara didn't even flinch. I have 3 of my own. Raised them by myself after my husband left us. And I did just fine, she said, typing away without looking up. Rhonda's lips curled. Gee, I wonder why your husband left you. Back at Joe's house, dinner was being served. Joe, say grace, Catherine Marie instructed. I'll go get her, Joey offered, standing up, but no one else moved. They hesitated, waiting, until Joe finally began eating. Only then did Cheryl, Joey, and Mike follow suit. Moments later, two plump, beautiful blonde women entered the kitchen, their eyes red-rimmed from tears. Catherine Marie turned to Mike. So why are you leaving? She demanded. Mike hesitated. I mean, the job's done, right? Joe looked up from his plate. We just started rolling it today. Mike shifted in his seat. Yeah, but my job's done. The framing is finished. Joe gave a knowing smile. But we. Meanwhile, under the blistering Texas sun, Rhonda stood on a doorstep, her jeans clinging to her hips and thighs, damp with sweat. Her blouse stuck to her skin, leaving her uncomfortable and overheated. The door creaked open. I'm Rhonda Morrison, she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Mike's ex-wife. The woman inside blinked in surprise. Oh, the voice exclaimed. Pause. Does he know you're coming? Rhonda exhaled. No, she admitted. For several moments there was only silence. Rhonda hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorbell. Just as she was about to press it, the door swung open. A blonde. Rhonda scoffed bitterly. Really? A blonde? She crossed her arms. We were together for 14 years. Can't you at least be a little civil? Mike raised an eyebrow, his smirk laced with sarcasm. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you like a glass of champagne? Some caviar? Golly, where are my manners? Mike, come on, she snapped. You think I want to be here? You came all this way. Let's just get to it, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Rhonda inhaled sharply. I don't know if you heard, but Michelle's getting married next month. The 9th. Mike nodded. Yeah. How far along is she? Rhonda flushed at his bluntness and glanced toward the backyard, where the pool shimmered under the afternoon sun. A month, she admitted. Mike barely reacted. Aha. He watched as Audrey stepped onto the diving board, bouncing slightly before jumping into the water. So why can't Mickey walk his sister down the aisle? He asked, his tone calm but firm. Rhonda's mouth tightened. He just got out of the treatment center. I know he's out, Mike said, eyes locked on her. But tell me, just how bad is your insurance? Didn't pay a dime for his treatment? Rhonda stiffened. What insurance? She spat bitterly. Mike chuckled, shaking his head. I know it covered $28,000 the first time. That was just my half. 31 grand the second time. And this last one? What was it? 38.5. Why do you always have to go on about it? Rhonda shrilled, her voice rising. Mike stayed cool. Did I ask you to come here? No, she snapped. Michelle did. Then maybe Michelle should have come, he said, pushing open the door to the sunroom. Inside, the sound of laughter filled the air. Hey guys. You all waterlogged yet? Audrey grinned as she climbed out of the pool. My fingers are all bumpy, she announced, wiggling them in his direction. Mike gasped in mock horror. Oh no, that's terrible. Rhonda huffed, folding her arms. Well, you seem to have done just fine for yourself. Mike smiled, unfazed. No thanks to you. Without another word, he ushered her toward the front door. The silence between them was heavy as he pulled it open and stepped aside. Rhonda didn't look back as she walked out. Mike shut the door with quiet finality. A few hours later, in the dim glow of their bedroom, Mike's wife laid her head against his chest, her blonde hair spilling over his skin. Her fingers traced lazy circles across his muscles. You're not going, she murmured. Mike exhaled, staring at the ceiling. And you think you're going to stop me? You're not walking her down the aisle alone, she said firmly, tightening her hold around him. He wrapped his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Baby, I know. I know it hurts, she whispered. She lifted her head, her green eyes searching his. Mike leaned in to kiss her, but she pulled away, her expression unreadable. Meanwhile, across town, a jogger struggled underneath a large dog, its leash tangled around her legs. The woman screamed, flailing as she tried to free herself. Mike rushed over, assessing the situation. He gently assisted the jogger while unhooking the dog's leash. Hold your dog and drop the leash, he ordered firmly. The dog's owner hesitated but obeyed as Mike managed to free the animal. The jogger remained on the ground, wincing in pain. A swelling was already forming on her forehead, and her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. Mike pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Yes, I've got a jogger here with a broken ankle and a possible concussion. The dog caused it. The dispatcher responded almost immediately. The woman says the dog didn't trip her. She just fell. Mike exhaled, glancing down at the injured woman. Whether it was the dog or not, she was in bad shape. Mike had always been smart with real estate. The previous owners had left their property in disrepair, but he saw potential. He managed to purchase the neglected home along with another nearby. Soon after, he acquired a few properties on Roberts Drive, a gated community where homeowners had overextended their credit. He sold 3 of the 4 homes at a solid return and decided to move into the 4th himself. During the day he worked for Skuro Construction. Evenings and weekends, he focused on renovations and reconstruction, flipping houses with patience and precision. His latest project was in the same gated community. "Your parents?" he asked, pressing further. She hesitated before answering. "Mom died of ovarian cancer." Mike nodded. "And your dad?" She swallowed hard, eyes darkening. "He told me, you're not my kid either. Either get out, or stay." Didn't matter to him. Mike glanced at his watch. "I've got about 2 hours of sunlight left to work. I'll be back." She gave him a sad smile, lowering her bed. Even in the shapeless hospital gown as she lay back, Mike could see her figure. And then he remembered. "Oxbow Lake," he murmured. "Ha?" she asked, pausing as she adjusted the bed. "That's where I've seen you before." The next morning Mike was at work, reinforcing the main load-bearing wall in the bank's lobby. His pocket vibrated, and the unmistakable riff of Back in Black by AC/DC rang out. He pulled out his phone. "Michael?" a soft voice asked. "Aha," he agreed, wiping sweat from his face. It was just after 10 a.m. and already the Texas sun was brutal. Mike walked over to the cooler, grabbing a paper cup of water. "They're discharging me today," Precious said on the other end of the line. "Be there. At least they'll feed you lunch," he replied, scanning the site for Joe. "No," she said quietly. "They already have." Mike exhaled, his gaze drifting. He knew where she was headed, back to that sweltering, dank apartment. And for some reason that didn't sit right with him. Mike pulled into the parking lot of Burns & Burns Supermarket, grabbed a few empty boxes from the stack near the entrance, and carried them back to his truck. When he arrived at Precious's apartment, she was already hobbling to the door, wincing with every step. She managed to get it open, eyeing the boxes suspiciously. "What are those for?" she asked, leaning against the frame. Mike stepped past her into the small, sweltering space. "Pack clothes, toiletries, whatever you need for the next couple of weeks," he instructed. "You're staying with me until you can get around on your own." Precious opened her mouth to argue, but then stopped herself. Just moving from the couch to the door had drained her. The thought of managing on her own, stuck in this apartment, made her stomach sink. She sighed. "Fine." Mike nodded, satisfied. Later that evening, as they drove through a well-lit neighborhood, Mike glanced at her. "Affluent neighborhood Christmas?" he asked, noticing the extravagant decorations lining the streets. "Yeah," Precious said, nodding toward a particularly decked-out house. "A lot of these places go all out with lights and displays. Some even do synchronized music." "Like Clark Griswold?" Mike asked. Precious blinked at him. "Who?" Mike let out a short laugh. "Griswold. Christmas Vacation. Still nothing." He shook his head. "We're fixing that." A few minutes later he pulled into his driveway. Precious was still trying to take in the sight of his home, craning her neck back to peer up at the third-story windows. "You got 5 windows up there," she said in amazement. "You need something in each one." Mike smirked. "You offering to climb a ladder?" She scoffed. "Not in this condition." He helped her out of the truck, making sure she was steady before leading her inside. Mike set her up in the guest room, bringing in an old tube television he had stored away. Then he heated a can of soup and slid it onto a slightly rusted cookie sheet, using it as a makeshift tray. The next day he drove to Rental and picked up a pair of aluminum crutches for her. Thus began 5 weeks of cohabitation. The first few mornings, Precious groaned about being woken up before sunrise for breakfast. By the 3rd morning though, Mike walked into her room to find her already wide awake, arms outstretched, waiting. "Guess you're getting used to it," he mused. "Nah," she teased. "Just figured you were gonna carry me anyway." Mike chuckled. "You got those crutches for a reason." At work, tensions lingered. The animosity hadn't faded between Mike and the guys who had been there the night Precious was injured. Even though he was no longer dating Tony, the resentment remained, compounded by his frequent need for time off. One afternoon, as he wiped the sweat from his brow, one of the older crew members sighed heavily. "Oh, Michael," he muttered. Why didn't you just say something? Mike exhaled. Would it have even made a difference? I could have asked one of my friends to take me, Precious said casually. Mike glanced at her, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Yeah, but I wanted to take you. Precious turned to him, her green eyes locking onto his brown ones. Why? Mike swallowed, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. Well, you know. Michael, she interrupted, tilting her head. I'm not saying it first. I need to hear you say it. Mike opened his mouth, then closed it again. His heart pounded. Precious just smiled, letting him squirm. Later that evening, she sat across from him at the dinner table, squeezing a generous amount of Texas heat barbecue sauce onto her brisket, followed by a healthy drizzle of Texas sweet. With a grin, she swirled the two sauces together using her index finger, then held it out to him, the sauce dripping. One condition, she said playfully. Mike smirked, taking her hand and licking the sauce from her finger. What's that? You marry me, she said, eyes twinkling. Day after Christmas. Mike leaned back, considering her for a moment before nodding. Give me about a month to find the perfect ring. Precious beamed, triumphant. Her smile grew even wider when Mike squirted the same two sauces onto his own plate. Gives me time to make sure you don't back out, he teased. A month later, under the warm glow of holiday lights, Reverend Landon Wright pronounced them husband and wife. Mike Morrison hadn't thought he could be happier. But then he found himself back at L's hospital, pacing the hallway as Precious screamed, wailed, gasped, and cried through 5 grueling hours of labor. In between deep breaths, grunts, and agonized declarations, she clutched his hand with a force he hadn't thought possible. I love you, she gasped between contractions, her forehead damp with sweat. You're my knight in shining armor. Mike kissed her knuckles, murmuring words of encouragement. And then at long last the doctor's voice rang out. Congratulations. You have 2 beautiful baby boys. Tears blurred Mike's vision as he looked down at his sons, Burren Michael and Russell Michael Morrison. 17 months later, fate worked in unexpected ways. Just 2 doors down from them, Toni Wright and her husband, Emmanuel, welcomed their first child into the world. Life had come full circle. That night, as Mike settled onto the pull-out sofa in his man cave, the weight of fatherhood, love, and everything he had built settled over him. He took a deep breath. Somehow, against all odds, this was exactly where he was meant to be. I'll go check on the boys, Precious said, standing up. What? They're just... Mike started, reaching for his phone. Precious placed a gentle hand on his, stopping him. I'll give you some privacy, she said softly, leaning down to kiss him. Love you, Mike murmured. She smiled. Love you too. As she stepped out of the bedroom, Mike took a deep breath and dialed. After a few rings, a guarded voice answered. Hello? Mike's stomach clenched. Later that evening, Precious whispered, She's here, slipping her hand into Mike's. Nope, Mike said bluntly. Maybe she's stuck in traffic, Precious suggested, trying to keep her tone light. Mike's jaw tightened. Sweetheart, did you see any traffic out there? His voice was sharper than he intended. Raquel Falls has to be traffic-free. If they want traffic jams, they can move to the city. Precious sighed, letting it go. How do we do this? She asked, shifting the conversation as she helped guide the 3 children to the counter. All right, Mike said, his voice warming. First, you order your burger. You want a 4B, a half PB, or a 20B? Audrey furrowed her brows. Oh, 20B. Mike chuckled. Sweetheart, Daddy's full of bull. That's not a real thing. Michelle smirked. That is his name. Mike exhaled through clenched teeth, keeping his composure. Precious Morrison, he said, turning to his wife. This little cutie here is Audrey. Audrey perked up. I'm 4, she announced, holding out her hand for the tall man behind the counter. And the big guy there, Mike continued, is Bertrand. And the one next to him is Russell. Finally, he turned toward his eldest. Guys, he said, his voice softer, this is your big sister, Michelle. Bertrand waved shyly. Hi. I'm 4, Audrey repeated, determined not to be ignored. Hi, Russell added. Michelle crossed her arms. So what? You just thought you'd come back and I'd be all like, oh wow, so great to see you again? She sneered. Mike sighed. Don't worry about being all over me, he muttered under his breath. When he pulled up to the rundown apartment complex, a teenage boy, probably 15 or 16, stepped in front of his truck. Yo, you can't park there, the kid said. That's my boy's spot. Know what I'm saying? Mike glanced at the sign that read Visitors Only. Oh, so your boy's name is Visitors? He snapped, reaching across the passenger seat for the wrapped package he had brought. The kid smirked. Now, if you was to let me hold 5. Ain't gonna happen, Mike said flatly. And pull your pants up, kid. The boy scoffed but stepped aside as Mike moved toward Rhonda's door. Inside a small cinder block room, a sullen 17-year-old sat at the table, staring at the surface as if it held the answers to life. Mike sat across from him, clearing his throat. Mickey? No response. Mike tried again, but Mickey wouldn't even lift his head. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, the boy sneered, "Oh, and thanks for those cheap Benny's Burger Bar gift cards." "You're welcome," Mike said easily. Mickey scoffed. $1 doesn't buy much at Benny's. Mike just smiled. "Depends what you're hungry for." "I know $10 doesn't go far at Benny's," Mike admitted, leaning back in his chair. Mickey scoffed. "A quarter-pound burger, fries, and a drink is at least 14. Mike smiled. "So why the hell did you only send a $10 gift card?" Mickey shot back. Mike exhaled, shaking his head. "Figured you'd appreciate a little challenge." Mickey rolled his eyes but said nothing. Mickey had been sentenced to 2 years. Since his sentence exceeded a year, he was required to serve his time in a Colorado state penitentiary. Barbara had managed to get him assigned to 5 tribes, a medium security facility, not exactly lenient but better than the alternative. A few months later, Mike received unexpected news. He was a grandfather. Michelle had given birth to a baby girl, Louis Charlotte Schron. When Precious heard, she turned to Mike, concern etched across her face. "Michael, that's not right." Mike didn't answer. And then, through Barbara, he received even worse news. His granddaughter hadn't lived. Of all the conversations Mike had ever faced, this was the hardest. Sitting down with Audrey, he took a deep breath and gently held her small hands in his. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "we may not see Mommy again. God asked her to come stay with him in heaven, so she's gone into a deep sleep. And she might not wake up for a very, very long time." Audrey stared at him wide-eyed. For a moment he wasn't sure if she understood. Then she nodded. "Okay. Let her sleep." Mike swallowed hard. "We should go home," she added matter-of-factly. "The baby needs to be fed. It's been a long time without Mommy." Mike wasn't sure if Audrey was playing a game or if somehow she had already stepped into the role of the big lady of the house. At the funeral, surrounded by grief-stricken faces, Audrey did something no one expected. She turned to the mourners, her tiny voice clear and unwavering. "Please don't cry," she said. "My Mommy is with God." The room fell silent. Tears welled in Mike's eyes. He couldn't take it anymore. He rushed forward, wrapping Audrey in his arms, and let his tears fall freely. Audrey held him, her small hands gripping tightly. "I'm here for you, Daddy," she whispered. Once the funeral ended, life moved on in its slow, painful way. 2 years later, Mickey was released from the penitentiary. But freedom didn't change him. He fell back into his old ways, hiring a sex worker, getting high on cocaine. He never made it home. His body was found in the wreckage of a massive highway crash. Sitting alone one night, Mike sighed, staring into the darkness. "Now, if she'll ever know it, I forgave her," he murmured. "When I married your mom, I just never told her. And now, I never can." Beside him, Precious reached for his hand. "You don't need to tell her," she said gently. "Just tell yourself." Mike slept well that night, still marveling at how a 14-year-old could speak with such wisdom. 23 years later, Mike was sleeping again. But this time it was forever. Once again, Audrey walked up to the stand, the weight of grief heavy on her shoulders. She took a steadying breath and spoke. "My name is Audrey," she began. "The last time I was here, I was 4 years old." Audrey took a deep breath, steadying herself as she stood at the podium. The church was filled with familiar faces, some older, some barely changed, all gathered to say goodbye. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My name is Audrey," she began. "The last time I was here, I was 4 years old, standing in front of you all, telling you not to cry because my Mommy was with God." She paused, glancing at the casket that held the man who had been her anchor, her protector, her father. "I never thought I'd have to stand here again, not for him." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, sniffles and quiet sobs breaking the silence. Audrey exhaled, gathering herself. "My dad, Mike Morrison, wasn't a perfect man. He'd be the first to tell you that. He made mistakes. He lost people he loved. He held on to regret longer than he should have. But he also loved, deeply, fiercely. And if you were lucky enough to be one of the people he loved, then you knew what it meant to be protected, to be cherished." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "Dad taught me how to be strong. How to fight for the people I love. how to get back up when life knocks you down. And even when he was hurting, even when life was unfair, he still managed to make everyone around him feel safe. She looked out into the crowd, locking eyes with Precious, who was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I remember when I was little, I thought my dad was invincible, Audrey said, a small, sad smile forming. That nothing could ever break him. That he'd always be there. But time has a way of showing us the truth, doesn't it? She took another breath, looking down at the speech she had written, words that suddenly felt unnecessary. Carefully, she folded the paper and set it aside. Dad, if you can hear me, she whispered, her voice cracking, I hope you know, I was always listening. To every lesson. Every story. Every late-night talk when you thought I was asleep. And I promise I'll carry them with me. Always. She reached out, pressing her hand against the polished wood of the casket. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for being my dad. Audrey stepped back, swallowing down the lump in her throat. In the front row, Precious reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. As the service continued, stories were shared, memories brought to life one last time. Mike Morrison had lived a full life, a complicated, messy, beautiful life. And now he was at peace. As the final prayer was spoken and the procession made its way to the cemetery, the sky above them shifted. A quiet snowfall had begun, dusting the ground in white. Audrey tilted her head back, letting the cold air fill her lungs. She swore for just a moment she could hear his voice in the wind. I'm here for you, sweetheart. Audrey smiled through her tears. She knew. She would always know. The end.